We've talked about music shops. What was the role of nightclubs?
So nightclubs played a really important role in, particularly in youth culture. When we look at the 1950s and early 1960s and political rallies, particularly around the interracial movement, predominantly the bands that are being booked are being booked to play in town halls, almost overwhelmingly in town halls. The dances are at Lambeth Town Hall, Hackney Town Hall, Kensington Town Hall. And if they're not being booked to play at town halls, then they're often being booked to play at Methodist church halls instead, because the Methodists played a really important role, particularly in the interracial movement. Actually, as nightclubs started to be established as commercial enterprises, they were alongside significant nightclubs. A lot of the youth clubs which we read about actually are also coming out of the Methodist church halls. So if, as a young person in Brixton in the 1960s, you're going out for a night out, you're as likely to be going to a Methodist church hall like St Paul's Crypt, for example, in Deptford, as you are to a commercial nightclub like the Ram Jam, for example, on Brixton Road. And so I think, again, actually, it's an important thing to remember, because we have, again, this kind of spectrum of kind of live music spaces, live DJing music spaces, the blues parties on the one hand, the nightclubs. But actually, when you start plotting out where those different nightclubs are, so many of them are Methodist church halls or youth clubs sponsored by the Inner London Education Authority, for example, rather than specifically commercial ventures. Where we do see more commercial ventures is actually in the West End, for example, the Q Club, the Gillies nightclub, Whiskey A Go Go, which becomes quite important for soul music. But yeah, there's a real kind of variety of outlets that are playing this music.
So can we just clarify, because that's such an interesting point. So just to say that the first kind of aspect of this are those nightclubs that are sponsored by, or nights sponsored by Methodist churches and the Inner London Education Authority.
Absolutely. Yeah,
can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So for example, at the same time, so we talked a moment about Desmond's Hip City, which is a record shop in Brixton. There's also, at the same time that Desmond's Hip City is running in the early 1960s, there's a nightclub called Hip City Disco, which is run in a church hall in Deptford by a Methodist minister. And it's run as a youth club, but the minister quickly finds that people are far more likely to come to this youth club if he books a local sound system, and it becomes, in effect, a kind of a young person's nightclub set up in a youth club enterprise. In that case, we're talking about Methodist ministers. There's a similar one in Ridley Road.
The name? What was the name?
Yeah, it's called Hip City Nightclub in St Paul's Crypt in Deptford, and Railton Road Youth Club in not Railton Road Youth Club, Richmond Road Youth Club in Hackney, just north of Ridley Road Market, was again one. There's fantastic accounts of, you turn the road off Dalston Road, which is the main street going up through Kingsland Road, main street going up through Dalston, and you can hear the reggae from the moment that you turn the corner onto Richmond Road. You still have to walk about 200 metres before you reach the youth club. This again is a Methodist church hall, and it's being sponsored by a Methodist minister involved in youth work. On the other hand, we've then got places like the Metro Youth Club which is a very famous youth club and nightclub in Notting Hill, which is actually directly sponsored by ILEA, by the Inner London Education Authority, and they sponsor a lot of youth clubs around the city, which very quickly really become, to all intents and purposes, nightclubs, and this leads to a lot of conflict later on, particularly as police start targeting youth nightclubs, particularly in the late 60s and into the early 70s. But this is where these are coming. They're not exclusively commercial enterprises. A lot of them are being sponsored through.
So one of those first ones set up by the Inner London Education Authority, what date did they set up?
That's a good question. from throughout the 50s and 60s, the Inner London Education Authority is sponsoring youth clubs across the city. But and a lot of these are initially attempted as, again, in the spirit of the interracial movement, as interracial affairs, usually with white youth club leaders, and usually playing ping pong and cards and darts and so on. And by the mid-60s, a lot of these youth clubs start experimenting. I'm guessing really at the request of some of the young people going to them, it start experimenting and bringing in sound systems. And what is actually often happening when you read the accounts of youth club leaders, is that there becomes actually in their terms, a takeover of those youth clubs by young black people, and what began with the ambitions of an interracial nightclub become a kind of young black people's music space. And initially there's a lot of resistance to this, but by the late 60s, by about 1968, most youth club leaders are becoming more comfortable with, or at least resigned to, the fact that if they're going to run a youth club that they want people to come to, then they're going to have to accept that it's going to play reggae music, and it's going to be predominantly young black people going to these. So there's not really a kind of moment of transition or a moment of inauguration in which India starts sponsoring black youth clubs, but instead there's a kind of a transformation of those youth clubs by who's actually turning up to them and what they're doing. They find out if we don't put this music on, then no one comes. If we do, then it often kind of turns into a black music space, or a black youth club or a white youth club.